before we get started so all the participants can join the room. We thank you for joining today's webinar, and we have an exciting panel of speakers with us. So we'll just give you a couple more seconds until we've got just under 60 participants. That's great. All right. Well, why don't we go ahead? Thank you so much. Really excited to have this conversation with everyone today, particularly in light of what the topic is today. Our subject matter for today's webinar, dealing with trauma during the pandemic. There's many ways that we could interpret that title and many directions that this conversation could go. My name's Cameron Matthews. I'm serving as a Chief Medical Officer with the Veterans Health Administration based here in Washington, D.C. And I'm also a member of the NMQF Advisory Board and am excited to help moderate today's session. We are really looking to go deep on today's conversation. The question that we face as a nation, as a healthcare community, as a group of policymakers is one that's actually quite large. But I'm even hoping to take the conversation even broader than what the title alone just focuses on. When we think pandemic, we are of course referring to, and most probably are reacting to, the coronavirus pandemic, of course, that's affecting our communities and overwhelmingly, particularly in Black and Brown communities at alarming rates. But I think it's also worth discussing and acknowledging and building into the conversation is that there's another pandemic that's affecting us that's actually at the forefront of a lot of our minds, especially in this year. Is the pandemic of racism, of hate, the inhumane treatment of certain communities, even by our very institutions, which we are a member or that are meant to serve us. You could also think of a third pandemic in reaction to both the virus and other issues that are affecting our society, the economic devastation. That's actually coming along with social impacts of the virus and even racism. So really, no matter how you define what the pandemic is, the goal that we have today is to really assess the impact of these pandemics, of these external forces on us as individuals and at the community level. So therefore, there's a question of how we define trauma up front. How do we actually identify it? How do we acknowledge it? We need to do that before, of course, we can evaluate and look at treating or finding solutions as far as the consequences of these pandemics. So a couple of definitions just to level set that we'd like to share. Number one, trauma is the response that we have experiencing or witnessing an event or series of events that threatens our life, our safety, and our personal integrity. Second, trauma overwhelms the ordinary human adaptations to life. It confronts human beings with the extremities of helplessness and terror. We need to recognize, of course, that we can look at trauma in multiple wide ranges of buckets. Of course, me being physically even located here at VHA, we need to look at trauma within warfare, within military experience, but there's broader concepts of family, sexual trauma, within incarceration, within immigration populations, other disaster situations that even some of our colleagues, you on the West Coast, are dealing with as far as our fires. We've got hurricanes coming up through the Gulf Coast. I mean, there's multiple different environmental impacts as well. So with that, I'll definitely be asking the panelists to expand upon their concepts of definitions. There are many more, trust me. I'm purposefully staying away from more of the structured definitions within our textbooks. I think we need to explore definitions, but more importantly, I want to challenge our panelists to identify ways on how we're going to move the needle on identifying and responding to trauma. So not just how are we defining it, but what are we doing to address it? So I'm going to ask each of them to speak for a couple of minutes. I'm also going to ask them to introduce themselves, because I think they'll do a much better job at highlighting some of their background, but you are definitely going to be impressed as we share a great deal of expertise amongst the three of them. Joining us today, we have Dr. Sharon Barboza, Ms. Julie Novak, and Dr. Art McCoy. Again, I feel bad not even reading their bios, but let's jump into this and it will come out, because I feel like I'm going to be wasting a little bit of time because I have your bios, but I don't want to read them. So why don't I start with Dr. McCoy, if you don't mind. Again, just focusing on, of course, please give your background, but we want to emphasize success and programs that have been successful, metrics for success. How do we approach trauma and how do we actually address it more than anything? But thank you so much, Dr. McCoy.
It's a pleasure to be with you. And just for the sake of staying on point, how many minutes do you wish us to take? 10 minutes? 7 minutes?
10, and we'll fine tune with the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen immediately. I'm Dr. Art McCoy. I'm Superintendent of Schools for Jennings School District. I'm also the president and founder of SAGES. And I oversee at least 20,000 people in my current community, but over 1 million people across the country for a period of time on workforce development, trauma-informed practices, leadership, and more. And so I want to share with you some best practices, but I always begin, and hopefully I'm sharing my screen, with student voice. And so let's start with the voices of our children. So first, how do we deal with trauma? I have students and adults express it by journaling. Here's a poem directly expressing the thoughts of one individual, then I'll share another one. It's entitled Hard Times, especially during this Corona situation. Grandma just died. There's no family nearby, feeling like Godzilla's bride, because every 2 hours, at least one of us aspires from an act of violence. All I do is feel empty inside. There's no understanding these hard times. It doesn't help to get high. Go to school? I can't. Church? Why? Don't deny that even if I could, it wouldn't help. There's too much pain, too much pride. Call it fate, but hate helped me just get by. And to my surprise, a new feeling visits my mind. When all alone late at night, it seems justified. It's a suffocating feeling inside. It says, I'm your savior. God? No. Suicide? Yes. Suicide. We know that suicide is a leading cause of death for 10-year-olds to 35-year-olds before the pandemic. It's the second leading cause of death. And for the first time in history in 2015, African-American males were at the top of that list versus Caucasian males by a method of suffocation. So the term I can't breathe is more exacerbated during the pandemic, but it was an epidemic before this pandemic. The next expression from a student directly, this one I've seared on my heart. I could say it without it being shown to you, but I'll let you read it as I speak it. Who can I turn to? I'm a person lost in the world. I don't know where to turn. I'm a girl wanting to achieve at anything I do. I want to be treated like I exist. I want to be seen for more than the outer me. I want to be seen for the person placed inside of me, but I feel all alone in the world. I feel like there's no one out there to run to when I feel like it's the end of me. Sometimes I want to run away to a place where no one can hurt me. Sometimes I feel like life for me will never go right. As much as I try, it will never go right. So what should I do if the problems I face won't come up from this deep, dark place inside of me? Who can I turn to if I can't turn to the person who gave life to me? Then who can I turn to? This expression, because many of us are professionals, shows anxiety, it shows suicide, it shows issues of depression, it shows what people are going through. But when you're able to write it, it's empowering to write it. It's enlightening to see the truth in ink, and it's engaging to share your truth with the world. When this young girl shared this with me, I said the whole world will see it, and that's why you're seeing it. And now over 3 million people have seen it in the book published there. It's been on several things, including the Huffington Post. But ultimately, people are asking, who can I turn to? Because before COVID, 7 out of 10 individuals had been traumatized. Since COVID, I would argue that 9 out of 10, if not all of us, have experienced some trauma. The last expression I would like to share is this one that was written after the death of George Floyd. A decree for victory. I can feel the change rising within me, wanting to bring hopes of our desperate society, longing to lift up hearts filled with anxiety, but quietly questioning how and why me. I can hear the silent agony of our steadfast generation and the endless questioning about and doubts amid their inner altercation. Silent screams for help, wondering how long they'll be patient and fearing they'll never be heard in our ignorant nation. I can see the best of nature slowly wilting away. As we selfishly poison it throughout night and day, faithfully holding out as its color begins to gray, hoping that we'll realize our careless actions someday. Yet I can smell the raindrop dew, pointing towards a day anew, never forgetting what our hearts went through, but beckoning the change to come from me and you. I can taste the victory near, transforming tears to vitality. So I'll end this plea with one last decree. If not them, then how about me? That was written by a sophomore student at the death of George Floyd. So what do we do in education right now during COVID? We must focus on Maslow's hierarchy of needs above Bloom's taxonomy. That means the physiological needs, the safety needs for security, and more so having a roof over your head, but even food and the normal things that you have to do to nourish your body, employment, which is essential when people are being unemployed during COVID. Then love and belonging, connection, even like we're doing now virtually. We're physically distanced, but we are not socially distanced. This is love and belonging and connection. And lastly, esteem and self-actualization. Now, we've done this as a school district, and before COVID, we were touted as being innovative, creative, and just trailblazing. But now it's barely enough to have 2 homeless shelters that we own and operate to serve students who need shelter, the safety needs, to have 2 grocery store food hubs that we've given over 1 million pounds of food in the past month, to have 2 health-based clinics, which you're seeing individuals in right now. And we're doing COVID testing at those clinics. Here's our homeless shelter that you see. Comfort spaces in schools, 2, 1 for adults, 1 for parents, 1 for students and 1 for adults, parents and staff, to just have biofeedback, to understand the trauma you're facing. Gardening, eating healthily, getting the right amount of nutrition, actually being resilient enough to create something. Because just because times seem overwhelming and it feels paralyzing, just because you can't do everything doesn't mean that you shouldn't do anything. So we must do something. These are students pre-COVID, and we had students post-COVID doing the same thing, but with masks on, giving groceries. Art therapy with adults, professional experts and students. That young man is at Harvard right now. This picture was from last year. Students doing COVID testing through the RNA method, working in conjunction with the university. Students as pharmacists, so being engaged, active, individually, together. And even while our president was talking about building a wall, we have students engaged in building a wall so they can be equipped and empowered to take over their lives, no matter their trauma, their situations. Getting students enrolled or engaged in voting, because even though they may not all be able to vote, they need to practice, and they are citizens today. They can influence parents and others. Taking charge of your life. That's essential. But the key is this: moving from an I in illness to a we for wellness. When we replace that disposition of I, which can be a sinking location, where you sink into yourself and the despair of yourself and often go into a state of hopelessness. When we remove I and replace it with we, because someone sees you, I see you. And if someone says, I support you, and someone says, you are sufficient, and if you are not sufficient, then together we will be sufficient as Centers for Healing Engagement. that's our community approach. Then you move the I to we, because I see you, I support you, and you are sufficient. And if not you, then we are sufficient. And that replaces the I in illness to the we in wellness. And so with that, I close to say that while there are so many things happening, we cannot let the overwhelming state of everything affect us from not doing anything. Each of us must do something, use our circle of influence, use our professional expertise, and ultimately be the champion for some community, some kid, some person somewhere, some citizen, and ultimately help them see themselves, let them know that they are supported, and let them be sufficient together, us working together. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Dr. McCoy. Thank you for your focus on solutions. I think those will be well received, and I'd love to hear feedback from the audience once we get to the Q&A session. So why don't we move next to Dr. Barboza?
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. McCoy. Thank you, Dr. Matthews. So I am Sharon Barboza. I am a clinical psychologist. I have spent the past 20 plus years working in prisons and jails, providing services as well as overseeing and monitoring services. My expertise focuses primarily on issues of crisis management as well as trauma-informed services. And I'm going to share with you my thoughts around incarceration. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will go the way that we need it to. So first, I just want to share that incarceration, the setting of incarceration, really can be thought of as an extension of our community. So what we see inside the prisons and jails, we see the systemic and institutionalized racism that we see outside, we also see inside. We see those inequalities that we see outside in the community, inside jails and prisons. We have exposure to violence. We have community and individual trauma. We have an overall sense of a lack of safety. People don't feel safe. And I think especially lately, we've been hearing more and more from both staff and incarcerated people around COVID and feeling trapped inside of these places and feeling unsafe in terms of their health, their physical health. We see limited choice, both outside and inside, in folks' ability to access healthcare, to make choices about their healthcare. And then especially inside of institutions, we see they have limited access to various things that they may have access to on the outside. And we also have an overwhelming sense of this suppression of voice, that people just cannot speak up and say, these are my needs and this is what I want. So when I think about trauma, and I know Cameron asked us to talk about trauma, so I'm just going to go through kind of two ideas I have about trauma. So first, just as a blanket statement, I envision trauma in its simplest form as being the imbalance between one's experiences, both external and internal, and the resources that they have to meet those challenges. And so when one's resources are overwhelmed, they often experience traumatic reactions. Just what is coming at them can't be metabolized and just can't be processed in a way that's healthy. So when I think about trauma, I think about direct trauma. And in most cases, that's an interpersonal trauma. So things like physical abuse and sexual abuse and emotional abuse, where it's person-on-person trauma. And while there are other traumas that whether that's a natural disaster or other things that certainly people are affected by, when I'm speaking about these incarcerated settings, I'm talking about direct trauma. And I also want to be clear that the violence that's experienced by both inmates as well as staff in these settings can precede incarceration. So childhood experiences of trauma, as well as within the setting. And again, it impacts both the staff and those who are incarcerated. So both can be impacted by that direct trauma. And then in addition to direct trauma, we often see this other kind of trauma. And vicarious trauma is what has been labeled as the cost of caring. Folks who provide care and treatment, so whether that's physical health care, mental health care, to folks who have experienced trauma in their lives, can often experience the effects of that over time. And it's different than burnout. Vicarious trauma really is this kind of wearing down of one's hopes and expectations of good in the world, just from this repeated exposure to hearing the stories of the trauma of the people that they work with. So that's vicarious trauma. And then secondary trauma is a more acute experience that folks can, it's almost akin to PTSD, to post-traumatic stress disorder, where it's this acute reaction to hearing about someone else's trauma, that sometimes we can hear a story that's just so sharp that it affects us in a way as if we've experienced that trauma directly. So I want to be clear, that's when I talk about trauma, I'm talking about both direct, vicarious, and secondary trauma. And again, I'm specifically talking within an incarcerated setting, not only about the trauma of our patients and our incarcerated people, but also the trauma experienced by the healthcare staff and the custody staff who work in those environments. And what we often see out of both of those groups is behavior, right? We see violence. We see violence towards the self in forms of self-injury. We see substance use. We see withdrawing from other people. We see sort of behavior that is a symptom of an underlying condition. So I want to be clear that as in incarcerated settings, we often treat kind of what's on the headline. We often treat the behavior that we see, the overt condition, when really it's the underneath piece that needs the addressing. And we try to attack it as healthcare providers individually. So we try to meet with individuals. We try to directly address the symptoms of the person. And while I think that that's helpful for the individual, we can't ignore the context. We can't ignore kind of the systemic issues at play. So I want to talk about that today. I want to talk about the roles that we can play in sort of changing the culture of how we think about trauma. So statistically, depending on who you read and depending on how we measure trauma reaction, the range is anywhere, and I'm talking now about inmates specifically, anywhere between, some folks say 30% of inmates experience trauma and serious trauma reaction and disorder, upwards of 80 to 90%. And today I'm going to talk about trauma-informed care. And I just want to be clear that trauma-informed care invites us to take a universal precautions approach to trauma. And what I mean by that is, back when HIV came out, we stopped asking the question about who's positive and we just put gloves on. And so trauma-informed care asks us to do the same about trauma. We don't have to know that someone has had trauma in their past. We just need to treat everyone as if they've had trauma and other negative experiences, because they probably have. And so trauma-informed care takes a step towards changing the culture within our incarceration settings. And here are some of the parameters of that. It promotes understanding of how folks have been affected by trauma. It asks us to recognize that trauma and also minimize the day-to-day impact that we may have on folks who've experienced trauma. Trauma-informed services ask us to explain to our patients the procedures we're going to do, what the next steps are in terms of care and treatment. It asks us to provide them with an overall atmosphere of safety more broadly than just that one-to-one interaction in a healthcare setting. And finally, it asks us to prevent re-traumatizing. So to take those steps towards creating an environment that's less traumatic. And I'm sure you can all imagine, if you haven't been inside of a jail or prison, the environments themselves are loud, and there's a lack of privacy, and there's just an environment that doesn't necessarily support folks feeling safe. And the environment itself can often be re-traumatizing for our patients and our staff. So I've done some thinking about how we might want to solve the problem and how we might want to engage in creation of a culture that is more supportive of taking care of folks with traumatic histories. And so here are some of the things that I'm throwing out there as options that I've seen work in various locations. So to promote safety, it comes down to engaging with the person one-on-one, to providing explanations. And when you see abuse, report abuse, and encourage staff through training, and encourage other inmates through education how to report that abuse. For staff to carry themselves as worthy of the trust. Trust is so important in the provision of healthcare services anyway. And then you add to that the provision of healthcare within a setting like a jail or prison. And you can imagine that trust is not something that's easily come by. And so creating an atmosphere of trust, using peers to support one another can also be enormously valuable. When we're providing care and treatment in a setting such as a jail or prison, really encouraging that collaboration and that mutuality, asking patients what they want, what their outcomes, what they're hopeful for, and working with them towards a common goal rather than that more, top-down model of a physician saying, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, listening to our patients. What is it that they want from this healthcare encounter? Empowering people to use their voice, empowering them to have choice. And finally, taking a look at kind of the fixings of culture and gender and various other things that really do impact an individual, and making sure that if we don't know about the culture of our patients, to ask those questions, to learn about where they're coming from, so that we can better explain to them where we're coming from. And again, kind of meet in the middle in terms of providing care and services in a way that is both impactful but respectful of that person's needs. So when we take a look at research and the outcomes of trauma-informed care, whether that's in a healthcare setting or a jail or prison, what we find is that if you can provide a true trauma-informed environment, we see a reduction in overall criminal risk. In hospital settings, in psychiatric hospital settings, we see a reduction in having to put people in isolation, having to put people in restraints, sort of having to forcefully calm them down. We see a reduction in that when the setting is more trauma-informed. Folks report less distress, and I just want to be clear, that's not only patients, that's staff as well. So in those environments, we see a decrease in self-reported distress. We see a decrease in reported trauma symptoms, substance use, and as you see there, other behaviors. And also we see a reduction in staff calling out sick, and staff are present more and available to provide that care and treatment. And we also see an increase in a number of positive things. So we see patients increase engagement in treatment. We see their responsivity to treatment. So the treatments that we provide, they actually get more benefit from. They report, again, both staff and patients, improved self-perception, so they feel better about themselves. They express having better coping skills. They feel safer. And they also express feelings of trust and hope. And I can't overemphasize the importance of those two things, because especially in something as intimate as a healthcare interaction or a mental health interaction, you can imagine that if I don't trust my provider or my provider doesn't trust me, that treatment is never going to be effective. So that's my spiel, I guess, to say on the use of trauma-informed services within incarcerated settings.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much, Dr. Barboza. I hope our audiences, well, first, that this isn't the first time they're hearing about trauma-informed care, but I hope we'll get into that conversation as well, too. I really support the approach. And our last panelist, Ms. Novak, would you like me to go ahead and share your slides? Are you ready up front?
I'm ready. Yes, please.
Doing that now.
And I'm not seeing it. There you go. Good morning, everyone. I am Julie Novak. I'm the Vice President of Child Safety, Youth Protection with Big Brothers Big Sisters of America. You can go back to the first slide, actually. My role with Big Brothers Big Sisters of America is predominantly or first and foremost, to help ensure that across our 250 affiliates nationwide, the children that are served, we serve about 150,000 children across the country through local affiliate, nonprofit organizations, youth serving organizations. We are working through 150,000 roughly one-to-one mentors, and who work closely with our 5,000 professional staff to reach and have an impact on those children. So my role is to help advance best practice strategy to keep those children safe, first and foremost in Big Brothers Big Sisters programs across the country. Our work is done, as I said, in a one-to-one setting. It is all about human connection, and it was interesting how many times you said in your presentation, one-to-one. I think I was counting 3 or 4. It's such a profound and powerful strategy to utilize in working with not only children, but certainly adults as well. So that's my primary role. My secondary role is that I am responsible for having designed and with a lot of experts and implemented across the country through our 250 affiliates, trauma-informed care initiatives that not only look out for the physical safety of our participants, our families and children and volunteers, but beyond that, their emotional well-being as well, and with the goal of being the most impactful that we can be in achieving positive outcomes with children. and youth. And I just want to say, it's interesting to me that before COVID, I've spent my career in violence prevention. So I came out of college, more of an administrative background educationally, but I came out of college and fell into working in domestic violence and sexual assault, and worked directly with children and adult survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. And so, and then I got into Big Brothers Big Sisters work decades ago, and have spent my career here, and again have been responsible through my career of violence prevention and prevention of victimization. But it's always been interesting to me that before COVID, when we were traveling, and I'm not traveling now, when I would fly on a plane, I would, I'm friendly, so I introduce myself, usually meet a lot of people that way. And I was struck by how many times in those settings, I would be sitting by a chemist, a business person, a person from technology, I mean, all kinds of fields. And when I told them my title and who I worked for, I ended up having an hours-long conversation with the individual about children that we work with and families and the kind of work we do. And I was just always so struck with sort of the lack of exposure that many adults who walk around our world have around what children and families and adults have experienced in their lives. So in a nutshell, my work, our work as an organization, and our spin sort of on trauma, or what I bring to this panel, I hope, is an interpretation or an example of, we work with lay people. We're not working with therapists. I mean, we have 5,000 professional staff nationwide, but our work with children is done through volunteers. So our approach to being trauma informed has had to really look at, has had to adapt to what does that look like. We can't train people to be therapists. We have no intention of doing that. And whether or not that would, we just can't do that. So we had to find a solution, and we looked a lot of different places. We developed our solution with some phenomenal experts across the country. We've been working for over 5 years to get to our solution. And I want to share some of that with you today. But our solution had to be really, I would say, at the nature of humanity, the core of humanity, and helping people understand you can make a difference as an individual. It doesn't discount the importance of therapy and medicine and all of the things that we need in addition to the work that Big Brothers Big Sisters does. So real quickly, our mission is to really look for and ignite the potential in children, so that they can all reach their full potential. And you can advance to the next slide, Cameron. I want to talk a little bit about the children that we serve. Big Brothers Big Sisters has been around for 100 years, roughly, a little bit longer than that. And we have always, actually, our organization was started by a juvenile justice, a judge, who saw a need for children coming before him to have more caring adults in their lives. So that was a long time ago. How our organization has evolved since then, I think we've always worked with children that have complex needs, but this graphic kind of gives you an indication of what that looks like. And compared to the national average, we work with a significantly higher number of children that are coming from single parent homes, and we have work with a high number of children compared to the average that have had a parent who's been incarcerated or is incarcerated. Our families have struggled with violence and trauma themselves, so come with health issues in the mental health arena, as well as substance abuse issues. We have an opioid program that is funded by the Justice Department that is a terribly important program where we do specific training, for instance. The other thing I want to mention is that, I don't have it on this slide, but we know from studies before COVID that roughly 60% of our children in the US had been exposed to violence and victimization when asked in a confidential survey to their home. Just within the past year, if they had been exposed to violence or victimization, 60% said within the last year they had. That includes domestic violence, abuse and neglect to the child themselves, community violence, violence in schools, So add that number into the formula of what the children and families that we're working with live with or have been experienced in their lives. And what we're really dealing with is children with complex trauma in their lives, as well as parents often that have had experienced complex trauma. You can go to the next slide. Now add COVID into the mix and a program, programs that had been one-to-one, community-based, school-based, site-based, to some degree technology-based, although it wasn't our largest program by any means, now had to face the reality that we had to suspend that for the safety and well-being of everybody involved for a time period. At a time when these children and families we care so much about were struggling with even greater levels of anxiety, stress in their families, food insecurity, which they had already faced, but now more profound, higher levels of anxiety, loss of jobs. And we know also that certainly economic impacts as well. We also know from research outside of Big Brothers Big Sisters that in the violence prevention or violence child abuse and neglect arena, reports by mandated reporters of child abuse and neglect have sharply declined at the outset of COVID. They've continued to decline throughout COVID. At the same time, reports to organizations like RAIN, which is a nationwide organization that runs a phone line for support and to take reports of child abuse and neglect and sexual assault, their self-reports by children have gone up significantly over COVID. So as schools are opening back up, now reports by mandatory reporters are coming back as youth-serving organizations like ours, which an expert from the sexual violence arena said the other day on a Zoom call I was on with experts, really what our organizations, the schools provide to children in these settings are lifelines. So children miss that lifeline. Those are some of the effects that we've seen coming out of COVID. So we've worked toward trying to adapt our programs so that my daughter is a big sister in Florida. She's also working on her PsyD, but she has continued to reach out to her little sister who has been very isolated, and she's continued to reach out, calling her, doing Zoom calls as she can, and that's happened across the country. We've also set out opportunities to help deal with, help families with food insecurity, providing food and hopefully stress relief and worry relief for parents. So add to that, and you can advance to the next slide, Cameron. At a time of already building on the trauma that and stress that families were dealing with, as Cameron mentioned, what we're seeing in this country for racial injustice and the impact of institutional racism and systemic racism and in our communities, children and families dealing with an even higher level of illness and profound impacts from COVID. So we've made a commitment in our organization, along with about 25 or so other youth-serving organizations. And by the way, about 70% of the children that Big Brothers Big Sisters of America works with nationwide are children of color. So, it's just painful. It's painful all the way around to know what our children are dealing with. But we've made a commitment to, along with these other youth-serving organizations, to do what we can to name racism for what it is, and to say we have a responsibility to do everything that we can to make a difference. So I'm really, really proud of our organization and happy to see that work come about and be named. You can advance to the next slide. So from that aspect, looking at what we've seen really come to the forefront, thank God, over the period before and since George Floyd's death, is a recognition that trauma isn't always individualized. It in the form of racism, there's intergenerational trauma that's passed on from family to family to family, and systemic trauma that is even more impactful and profound. So our responses as an organization are trying to factor all of this in and adapt our programming so that we, in working with volunteers, really help them understand. For instance, in our screening process, we're asking, you know, trying to get a gauge of what are your biases and how might that affect the family and the child that you're working with, and making decisions early that maybe you're not the right individual to do this volunteer work at this time, or can we bring you along and help provide training? What supports can we provide so that you can make a difference in this child's life? Again, my primary role is first, do no harm to any of the children that we work with. So all of this kind of fits together. So I want to share with you, I'm not sure where I'm at on timing. I think I'm getting close. So I want to share with you just a few minutes long video that helps, I think, explain or portray how we've approached dealing with volunteers that come from all different kinds of backgrounds. Some have experienced violence and victimization and trauma themselves, complex trauma, but we want to make sure that, and actually we made a commitment to this in our strategic plan, that we would implement trauma-informed care across all of our organizations. We want to make sure that there's a basic understanding of everyone involved in our organization, staff person, leader, volunteer, of what trauma is and the impact. So let's play this video. And I'm not hearing it. I should be hearing it, Cameron. There you go.
Imagine a terrible storm. The winds are fierce and destructive, debris flying everywhere. Now imagine you are in the middle of the storm. The storm is bad enough. You can barely stand in the wind. But the debris, it's coming from all sides, and you're trying to keep from being hit. You can't focus on getting out of the storm because you're constantly rerouting to deal with the debris. Just when you think the storm has passed, the winds pick back up, giving you no rest or relief from the stress you're experiencing. Now imagine this is just the first storm in a series of many, and you have to try to live a normal life while surviving the storm. For children who experience repeated traumatic events, this is reality. Being on high alert or in survival mode for just a day, even an hour, is exhausting to both mind and body. Think of the most stressful situation you faced. Do you remember how you felt physically? Did your body tense up, your heart race, your mind? Now think about the moment when the stress was relieved, when you knew everything was going to be okay. Remember that sense of relief when every part of you relaxed? For children who experience toxic stress, this sense of relief never comes. Trauma is defined as experiences that cause intense physical and psychological stress reactions. It can refer to a single event, multiple events, or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically and emotionally harmful or threatening. This experience has lasting adverse effects on the individual's physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Trauma can also be described as a combination of event, experience, and effect. The event is an actual danger or extreme threat of harm. The experience is a fight, flight, or freeze response. If one is not able to escape the extreme stressor, this overwhelms the brain and the body's ability to cope. This has the effect of causing a breakdown of the parts of the brain and body that normally work well together, resulting in a loss of capacity to control internal stress and emotional states and potentially long-term adverse effects. We all experience and process events in our lives differently. What is traumatic to one child may not be traumatic to another. Trauma can be a single event in a person's life, such as the death of a loved one. It can be a recurring scary event, such as physical or sexual abuse. And it can also be multiple traumas happening at the same time over and over again. In the next video, you will learn about toxic stress and how being exposed to toxic stress continually over a long period of time negatively impacts a child's development.
Thank you. So that is just one of the tools that one aspect of the training that we do for offer to all of our volunteers. We also have a staff version. again, our goal is to raise awareness across the board with everyone in our organization of trauma, the prevalence of trauma exposure in our world, and the impacts that it has on children and families' lives, with the goal, and you can advance the slide, Cameron, of sharing also a hopeful message that caring adults are one of the most important aspects in a children's lives, or interventions in a children's life, a child's life, that help heal them from exposure to trauma. So that is, and I'll just keep going. Those are the messages that we're trying to share. The other thing that we provide to our BIGs or volunteers is our tools that, again, there's the hope of caring adults in children's lives. You can advance the slide to the next couple of slides. In the training, we also provide kind of a roadmap that just shows you just what the training includes. And you can advance again, Cameron, and tips that are not rocket science, frankly. They're very basic, and we worked with our partners, Futures Without Violence, based in San Francisco, to come up with really a formula for our volunteers that they can do every day, just everyday caring gestures that help children better self-regulate and know that someone is in their corner. So that is our approach to trauma, and thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ms. Novak. This has been wonderful. This is a great, really platform for, I think, all of us to have a good conversation. You've all posed some pretty amazing approaches from very different angles, which is why I love the fact that we were all able to come together. Off the top, let me quickly check. Nope, we don't have any questions initially from the audience, but I definitely want to invite all of you to use the Q&A function. We'll definitely look to address any questions that you may have. But off the top, I'd love if Dr. McCoy, you could go into a little bit more, because I mean, you were giving us such good vibe. I absolutely love it. But could you speak to any particular innovations that you've been able to do? And of course, your environment, your setting is focused on schools. But are there any innovative practices that our clinicians should know about, our policymakers should know about in this arena of even trauma-informed practices?
Sure, thank you so much, and I appreciate it. All the presenters, really great information. One of the biggest innovations, I believe, came from after I lost a kindergartner who was murdered about 2 years ago by the mother's boyfriend, pushed down the steps, died from internal bleeding. 4-year-old was hospitalized, so forth. Every time I have a student die, we create a program out of their honor. And I just happened to meet Dr. Joan Luby, who's a renowned child psychiatrist, and we instituted child-parent interaction therapy at the school setting. And so we were the first in the state of Missouri and the third throughout the country to have basically an 8-week to 12-week training for children and the parent to reestablish the boundaries and bonding of love. We actually gave EEGs to the students, and to see the lighting up of the brain, the frontal lobe cortex versus the amygdala, and to see the transference of having more executive function, but ultimately by having a bug in the ear for the parent to then guide them with the psychiatrist step by step of what they should say and what they should do when a child is having a meltdown, when a child is having a situation, or when the parent is becoming upset and frustrated, to reinitiate the bonding, the love, and the trust between the child and the parent. We actually paid parents about $500 per child to do it with their child. So some parents received like $2,000, $3,000, and ultimately completed it. And the impacts were that it was more effective than medication. It was more effective than other methods of behavioral modification. We did it with our most neediest 100 families, and then we scaled it to the most neediest 1,000 families in the region. So when we say we are a center for healing engagement, it includes child-parent interaction therapy, teacher child interaction therapy because we taught teachers how to bond, how to look at the behavior and not make judgment, and ultimately address the child where they're at, because their relationship is more important than their content or their task. So the teachers have to focus on that. And so ultimately that's been the most innovative. But I think that from that, this notion of Centers for Healing Engagement derived from that, where we had the framework, which I did share my slides so that everybody could click if they want to see it, this notion of a wellness and well-being framework as our mission. So most districts and schools have a mission that sounds like something we don't remember, to be lifelong learners in a global society that blah, blah, blah. It means nothing, really, not much. So our framework is to be well-dressed, well-fed, well-loved, well-equipped, well-in-spirit, wonderkinds, workers, and that's it. It's a series of wells that when you say it, you think of your own child, you think of yourself, you think of what we all need for wellness. And so I think that is the other piece that's innovative, that everything we do is about a wellness framework. And so we look at the spirit first. So I say souls first and students second, souls first and staff second, souls first and stakeholders second. And when you look at the soul of a person to say, what do we need for that soul to be well? That's the wellness framework.
Phenomenal. Thank you for those examples. And Ms. Novak, actually, I think it naturally flows into that roadmap. My goodness, I feel like if we had an additional 15 minutes that we could have just froze that on screen. I was like quickly trying to focus. So I hope the audience, I hope if you don't mind us sharing that. So I just want to sit and pour over. But are there particular points on that roadmap, kind of similar to my question to Dr. McCoy, that stand out? This is just, the entire roadmap obviously is critical, but are there particular pieces that maybe you found that either the youth that you're reaching, or maybe even the volunteers that are helping them along that roadmap, that really stand out as being the critical pieces, the critical even interventions?
Yeah, I think that, well, thank you. And that roadmap is really relaying all of the aspects of the training and shows volunteers what they're going to learn about. So talks about, again, raising awareness about what trauma is, the impact of trauma, the impact on the brain, and the brain science around healing. And the fact that simple things like throwing a ball, just playing catch actually helps children reform, helps repair connections that have been lost in what the science tells us about trauma's impacts in the negative sense. So I think the talking about, for instance, triggers, and there's a section on we address triggers, and again, this is an introductory training. We intend to do more trainings for volunteers and staff moving forward, and also address some of the racism, systemic racism trauma that's going on as well. So this is our first entree, but I think for volunteers, an example of why it's so important, and to go to the roadmap piece, when a volunteer is with a child, if they have no idea what a child may have experienced, and I say may have because we don't always know, even though we do intensive interviews and we ask these questions, to your point earlier, doctor, we don't know what children and families have dealt with. They don't have to tell us, and maybe they don't want to tell us, maybe they can't tell us. So it's really important to understand, for volunteers to understand the scope and the prevalence, and then how they're, how to interpret a child's behavior that typically ends up looking negative when they're dealing with stress and those reactions, the fight or flight. So those are just some examples. It's hard to pull one thing and say it's most important, because I think it's all, a picture.
That's fair. My goodness, good. We need to approach it in as comprehensive way as possible, and your training clearly addresses that. So then actually that makes me think, when you're taking one of your volunteers along that training roadmap, you might need to actually deal with their own trauma, I would think. That all of us that are in this matrix of needing to help our communities, focusing on individuals, like all of you stressed, we also need to deal with our own experiences. And Dr. Barboza, my goodness, I have worked in a correctional setting as well. What you need to do to actually address the trauma of inmates in a setting where you are probably dealing, the correctional officers that I befriended, were dealing with just as difficult issues. In fact, usually came from the very neighborhoods that the inmates were coming from, right? So they're exposed to a lot of those community events like Ms. Novak was describing and everything. How do you deal with it? How do you institute a trauma-informed environment when it's coming at you from every direction?
Right. No, it's unbelievable. Yes. I mean, I have certainly worked with officers and inmates who literally grew up together. I think it's what I was saying before about the culture, that you really do need to do training at all levels. I mean, very similar to both what Art and Julie were saying. I think training everybody, right? Addressing everyone's needs and everyone's trauma. So, engaging in staff training around vicarious trauma and secondary trauma and dealing with their own struggles outside of the workplace. I mean, Art was mentioning about suicide in kids. We see in various correctional systems, pockets of suicide amongst correctional officers. So, or just extreme substance use among correctional officers, or violence at home, or whatever the case may be. So I think, you can't just say that trauma-informed services needs to focus just on the recipient or the patient or the identified, right? I mean, what Art was saying about working with the parents and de-escalation and how to not meet violence with violence, and how, teaching staff that violence is often a request for help. Violence is, I don't have the words to say what I'm feeling, and so I'm going to act it out, and educating people on meeting that violence with something that helps to quell it rather than make it more explosive. So, I mean, it's a never-ending project, right? And I think we're all talking about the same thing, that you have to come at it from every angle. You can't just, it's not a one-time event where you do a training and everyone suddenly is trauma-informed. That day doesn't come. We have to keep on revisiting it time and time again.
Phenomenal, phenomenal. So we've got correctional settings as an institution responds in a very specific way to violence. Schools as well too, right? Dr. McCoy, like when there is violence, I mean, students tend to get expelled, right? You don't typically respond, let me support this student. It's let me remove this student.
Right.
You need to care for the other ones, but like, how do we deal with these institutions?
So shifting that, so we've stopped suspending kids from really pre-K through 6th grade for anything that's not an act of illegal action, like, murders, selling drugs, so forth. There's no suspensions. You keep them and you work through the behavior. And so, but it started with having discussions about it, having MOUs about it, having partnerships with the St. Louis Children's Hospital, having partnerships with others to really look at the whole child. So on suspensions, we also stop allowing police officers to make the school to prison pipeline larger, with MOUs to say you will not arrest a child for a behavior that's a childlike behavior. So someone kicks someone, okay, yeah, that's assault by definition, but that's also like a 3rd grade behavior if you get angry, if you don't teach them coping skills and work them through it. Preschool behavior, play therapy is like, hey, how do we play with each other? How do we talk to each other? How do we ask for something instead of just taking your ball or throwing the ball at you because you didn't give me the ball and the chair? How do we work through it? Don't arrest the kindergartner, which some have been arrested, not in my district, but in places that don't systemically do MOUs, agreements, and understanding how to work together from a wellness lens. Then the last thing I'll say is we took the risk of hiring 3 therapists. Well, first of all, we have 2 therapists for every school that we have, 2 that's in addition to what they may get from the hospital, what students may get otherwise, that are like counselors full-time on staff to help students. Then we took the risk to hire therapists for our staff so that we could have support internally in real time based off of what was needed before going to HR, before going to Concentra or whatever, in person, real time in the environment. That did wonders for the adults who were recipients of secondary trauma, because they had someone with them to walk with them, not to just to tell them or to medicate them. And so those are all strategies: MOUs, policies, and therapeutic staff for your staff, your adults.
Yeah. Well, Ms. Novak, I mean, how do we, like, schools, we can build support systems. We can get therapists in to help your teachers. Corrections, there's a lot, but I mean, Julie, you're dealing with a community, right? Where you have your volunteers coming in, again, probably exposed as well too. What do we tell our policymakers when clearly it could be coming from any angle, it could be any cause, it could be very private in the form of domestic violence or anything. Is Big Brothers Big Sisters, not to put you on the spot there, but are you guys advocating for any particular policy changes in order to address this, even outside of institutions?
So to address children's exposure to trauma, or something more
or
than that?
Or a response, either, honestly.
I mean, we get an awful lot of OJJDP funding, so we're trying to bring our trauma-informed initiatives to, you know, as many organizations, institutions as we can, and to be a model, as to the degree our model would be useful to other organizations. And I mean, I think it's interesting. We've had a tremendous response to, as we've exposed or shared our framework, which, as I said, I think is not easy to find in the kind of field that we're in. We've had a great response from institutions and other organizations. So sharing, and actually our resources, I'm happy to share the cards that I put up as slides for resources, and the video training kind of resources, web-based resources. We also are willing to share those for a fee. So if someone's interested in those materials, you know, let me know. But as I said, I think our first, most important step was to put this, bring the requirements, or the, you know, the strategy and the importance of understanding trauma exposure and how to best respond to it to the top of the organization and throughout the organization. So to look at a strategic planning solution that says, we're going to put this first and work to do that. And it's hard work. I mean, it is hard work. There's those conversations on the plane that I'm sure you all have, my colleagues have had. They're exhausting. You know, you get on a plane at 10 o'clock at night and this conversation comes up and you think, I'm not going to get home till midnight, and I'm going to be even more exhausted when I get there than I was to start. But you have them because you've got a bunch of caring and compassionate, you know, our teams nationwide, as I'm sure are yours. You know, any little opportunity you get to share this important message that has such an impact on lives, you do it.
Excellent. One great question. Do any of you, I'll open this to anyone, do any of you recommend any particular, or just the need at all for any government interventions, or maybe not even intervention, but just policy in order to assist maybe even the work that you're doing?
I want to just throw a plug in for the policy of HR 5469. It's the Pursuing Equity in Mental Health Act that was sponsored by Representative Watson Coleman, Bonnie Watson Coleman from New Jersey. That policy has in it everything that is the tenets of what we're talking about, from early screening so that you can have wide screening of issues for all individuals, to evidence-based practices in institutions, to caring adults, so that we can eliminate the violence in our silence by having more caring adults around. It is about 65 pages long. I would encourage you to check it out. Again, HR, so it's House Bill 5469, Pursuing Equity in Mental Health Act. And that's important. And I'll say it this way: when you have so many millions of feet on the street after being like in isolation for COVID-19, and then while in isolation seeing a knee on someone's neck, it led to millions of feet on the street. But ultimately, to say that we're willing to lose our lives now for more equity, for more liberty, for more justice for people. So I say, don't allow millions of feet to be on the street and don't settle for small change. You know, this isn't time for small change. This is time for big bills, which mean big dollars and big legislation and big action. So don't settle for small change. Let's make some big bills happen and some big action.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think just as much as it's an all hands on deck and comprehensive approach to an individual who has been traumatized, I also think we need to address the issue from every angle. So building it so that there's individually focused resources, but then also addressing how the government supports those activities, right? I think that's great. All right, just watching our time. I unfortunately do need to bring this to a close, but this has been a phenomenal conversation. I really do appreciate our three experts here. There's so much overlapping that I think is worth acknowledging, that all of you discussed the need to address the culture, that we have to acknowledge that trauma exists. And that we need to influence solutions that address individuals, that address community level effect, and really build. I love the phrases you stated. We need to build esteem. We need to engage. We need to focus on hope and trust. That there's got to be a uniform approach through trauma-informed care that all of your organizations provide. I think that's so critical. And it's going to take partnership throughout all of our different fields, right? And I think that's one of the benefits of our conference this week, right? We've got multiple different professions coming together. And I think that's where the recognition comes in, that it's not just the clinicians that are going to address this. We need this in the schools. We need this with their big brothers or big sisters. We need this when unfortunately it's, the trauma itself might have led them to be incarcerated, right? So I appreciate all of your attention to this. So thank you all for participating. Thank you to our audience. Hopefully this is the first of many conversations you'll have about trauma. And please continue to join the other sessions for the forum this week. It's going to be a great set of workshops. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Great job, Cameron.
Oh, I missed the question.
Look forward to seeing you soon.
Same.